For those of you who don't know, and for those of you who have forgot already, my name's Tom Galvin. I'm the new director at IVC here in Chicago. If you forgot who I was already, that's okay. Sometimes I forget who I am as well. I'd like to piggyback on Jim Sweeney's opening remarks and thank you all for being here today to celebrate the Feast of St. Ignatius. Special thanks to all past, present, and future IVC Service Corps members. Something else I'd like to bring to your attention is a program that we run to all IVC Service Corps members. We call it SIF. SIF stands for Seminars in Ignatian Formation. It's a program in Ignatian spirituality formation organized by the Midwest Province of the Society of Jesus and targeting all of the Jesuit institutions and organizations, including IVC, in the Chicago and Milwaukee area. Father Steve Krupa, one of our IVC chaplains, is the co-director of the program, along with Ms. Rita O'Malley. People who want to take a deeper dive into Ignatian spirituality and/or an introductory course in basic Catholic theology are welcome to take the 3 SIF seminars. Also, people who want to train to be spiritual directors, and particularly directors of the spiritual exercises, should consider SIF. If you take all 3 of the SIF seminars, you will be competent at the end to give the complete spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius to others. If you want more information about the 3 SIF seminars, please see Father Steve. Also, if you would like to make the spiritual exercises of Ignatius in the 30-week format in the year ahead, starting in September and going through early May, also see Father Steve. At the end of Father Joe's Q&A, please remain seated so Father Jack can say grace. Speaking of grace and the meal we will eat, special thanks to DeLeo's for catering the event today. Our guest speaker, Father Joe from Milwaukee, studied classics and Spanish at Marquette University and volunteer taught for 2 years before entering the Jesuits in 2006. He studied philosophy at Loyola University, during which time he volunteered at the newly opened Christ the King Jesuit College Prep. As a Jesuit in training, Joe taught at Cristo Rey High School in Minneapolis, followed by a year teaching philosophy at Creighton University. Throughout formation, Joe worked with Jesuit refugee service in Jordan and Lebanon, has given retreats around the country, and wrote and edited the Jesuit Post, a blog on faith and culture. After theology studies at Boston College, he was ordained in June of 2017 and served at St. Procopius Parish in the Pilsen neighborhood that summer. Since the last time Father Joe presented for IVC, which was in July of 2017, he has been writing his doctoral dissertation in theology and literature at Campion Hall, the Jesuit College at the University of Oxford in England. His dissertation, Atonements to the Grace and Writings of Virginia Woolf and Marilyn Robinson, is directed by the Regius Professor of Divinity, the Reverend Dr. Graham Ward. So without further ado, I'd like to present Father Joe.
Thank you, Tom and Jackie, for the kind invitation to come back. Apparently I wanted a second dose of this. I feel today like Batman in the old Adam West thing where he's like, Robin, hand me my shark repellent spray, and pulls it off there and sprays the shark to save Batman. I thought it would be interesting to focus our attention a little bit today on a letter that Father General Adolfo Nicolas, the previous Superior General of the Jesuits, wrote. It was a letter entitled From Distraction to Dedication, an Invitation to the Center. But before I get to that, I want to introduce another voice, a man by the name of Matthew Crawford. After I go through Crawford's insights, we'll look at Father Nicolas's letter, moving from distraction to dedication and invitation to the center. And along the way, I'll offer you some reflection questions that maybe you can jot down and have a think about. And there'll be a little time at the end of the talk in order to discuss, and then we'll have a larger group discussion. So first of all, this guy, Matthew Crawford. Matthew Crawford is an American writer and research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. As an undergraduate, he majored in physics, but then he turned his interest to political philosophy. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and was part of the Committee on Social Thought. Pretty sharp fellow. And after he graduated, he began working for a think tank in Washington in 2001. But he found himself writing these think pieces and arguments that he didn't believe in, things that would cynically use data to demonstrate things that he knew not to be true. As he put it, the trappings of scholarship were used to put a cover on positions arrived at otherwise. These positions served various interests, ideological or material. And so what did he do? Naturally, if you don't like your job, go work at a motorcycle shop. He found that working at a motorcycle shop pushed back on him in a way that bad ideas did not. When you're dealing with bad ideas or even just slightly correct ideas, you don't necessarily have to deal with all of the consequences of those. But if you don't fix a motorcycle properly, you will know immediately the effects and the people who will be responsible for it. You hear it in the sounds and you feel it in the rattle of the engine. This guy, Matthew Crawford, wanted to deal with things that could hold him accountable in the real world. And so in 2009, he came out with a book, Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work. And eventually he opened up his own shop that made motorcycles. A few years later, he wrote a book in 2015 entitled The World Beyond Your Head. And he talked about the importance of paying attention to where our attention is going as a culture. But not just where it is going when we go off into dreamland, but indeed where it is being directed and sold, whether we know it or not. The observations that he had began with simply checking out at a grocery store and putting in his bank card, putting in his PIN number, and then waiting. He figured it was just the technology that took a little time in order to return and say, you've been approved or you've been declined. But then he noticed that there were little advertisements that started popping up in between punching in his PIN number and saying that you've been verified. He said, well, that's interesting. Where did all this come from? Then he noticed on the tray table on a flight to Chicago that there was a little advertisement on it. So there he was, sitting 18 inches away from an advertisement throughout the entire flight. He said he arrived at O'Hare International Airport and was going up an escalator with an advertisement from the Lincoln Financial Group telling him, you are in charge. And he said, I didn't really feel like I was in charge at that moment. And in that book, he talks about in Seoul, South Korea, if you go on a bus, as it approaches the Dunkin' Donuts shop, there's a little puff of smell of fresh coffee that comes down. And in case you miss the message, the bus driver will say, next stop, Dunkin' Donuts. And he got the sense that I think my attention is being sold back to me. He called this the monetizing of our headspace. Now, animals, including us animals who wear ties and dresses and go to talks about spirituality, we animals have survived for many thousands of years by paying attention to materials that present themselves to us as novel or disruptive. Cognitive psychologists refer to this as the orienting reflex, whereby animals turn their eyes and ears to something that is novel. Is it a threat? Or maybe it's a friend. Maybe it's a source of food. These are important adaptations to the world of predators around us. Now, this is a difficult thing to negotiate, this orienting reflex, when you're waiting for a flight and all you hear and see is a television blasting on the terminal TV, and then you turn over here and lo and behold, there's another one. On TVs, a new image appears every second or so. And now you might put in your headphones, you might stare into your phone, you might try to turn away to turn off all of that chatter and noise. But Crawford points out in his book that what's lost in this is the common public space that allows for sort of sociability between people. And that doesn't just mean we're talking all the time, but it means that we have a certain respect for one another. We're looking around and sizing up one another. And when people aren't self-enclosed but open to spontaneous encounters, he says, to be the object of another person's reticence is not the same as not being seen by them. To be the object of someone else's reticence is not the same as not being seen by them. Think of what it's like when you've been sitting on a bench just watching people go by, or at the airport looking at other people, not being nosy, but just sort of taking in the environment. He says that such encounters are ambiguous, and they're open to interpretation. But we can't do that when our public spaces are claimed for other things, when our attention is directed elsewhere. He says that the exploitation of that orienting response keeps us from being sociable and directs us away from one another. The content of our attention is directed by people with a material interest for harnessing our attention. In psychological circles, attention is understood to be a resource, but more importantly, it's a finite resource. Each of us, including you, every day, are sizing up where you're going to be putting your attention. You're probably looking right now and thinking, maybe about 50%, I'll give him 50% of my time and attention. Maybe 75, or maybe I'm interested in this and I want to give him my full and undivided attention. It's a reasonable thing to do with our finite resources and time and energy. Crawford talks about the attentional commons, things that we share in common, like air and water. And he recognizes that these common goods are shared and we need them to do everything else we do in life. If we don't have fresh air to breathe, or clean water to drink, or attentional energy and silence in order to do our thinking and our creating. He says the absence of noise and what he calls the condition of not being addressed, just a minute to get your thoughts together, a chance to spend a little time getting your things and your mind and your heart organized. He says that fresh air allows us to breathe, and silence, that rare gift, allows us to think, no small thing. Now, of course, we give up silence willingly when we meet with other people, with family and friends, people that we have relationships with. Or we open it up to serendipitous exchanges when we go to church, or we go to talks like this and we're going to meet some new people that we haven't met before. But when people are selling our attention on our phones or on screens, or when we flip down the little thing, our tray on an airplane, that's a little bit of a different thing, he says. He goes on to talk about what the benefits of silence are, just in a very practical human letter, not even getting to the spiritual level. He says that those benefits of silence are very difficult to quantify. They're off the books. We can't measure them with gross domestic product. You can't measure them by your level of education. You can't put it on a CV. You can't record it with your academic achievements. But silence and focus are crucial for all of these other things to happen. Tom mentioned that I'm finishing up a doctorate in Oxford, and no, I'm not Dr. Simmons yet. I'm not finished. I haven't even submitted yet, which is a cause of minor anxiety for me, but I am landing the plane. I can see it coming up, so, as I tell my mother. So, I'll tell you, working on a doctorate in silence for an extrovert like myself for 4 years is acutely difficult, and I know very well what distraction is like, so I'm not preaching as if I have all of this figured out. In fact, my room was never cleaner than when I had a deadline coming up that night. I'm like, well, I can't work with all this mess around me here. You know what it's like when you're sort of engaging in those distractions. I just came from a week with my family up in Milwaukee, and I have 4 little nieces and nephews who will absorb all of the time and attention and energy you will give them. And rightly so. They're little kids with lots of needs. But this guy, Matthew Crawford, argues that in our world, silence and a lack of distractions are treated as luxury items. You can go to a first-class lounge at an airport where you won't deal with noisy televisions or advertisements, just clean white walls and muted furniture colors and the occasional sound of a teaspoon clinking against the side of a glass. You can go to a spa. You can get away to go on retreat. Maybe you could even go to a library. Remember libraries? Here is where I think Adolfo Nicolas comes in. I think Crawford lays out the problem that we find ourselves in, and Adolfo Nicolas offers a challenge specifically to us Jesuits, but I think it goes for all of the people who are interested in living out a life of faith, people who want to pay more attention to God's call and invitation in their life. At the spiritual level, we need to get away to go on retreat from time to time. We need to reflect on the work that we do, whatever it might be, moving away from distractions and, yes, even the good energy and work that we do. And that's where I want to look at us, focus our attention today. This guy, Matthew Crawford, is not especially religious himself, but he does identify that spiritual problem, and Adolfo Nicolas, I think, sharpens it for people of faith. So around 10 years ago, he wrote a letter under Pope Benedict's pontificate, but it wasn't even a full letter, just notes that he had sketched out that he shared after his death. And that moves us to this letter itself, from an invitation to the center. Nicolas offers in the letter some nuanced observations, which I will list here at the beginning, and we'll go through each of them. And as I said, I'll offer you reflection questions. The first one, he talks about distraction in prayer as being embedded in a larger sense of distraction in our life. The second one is he talks about the subtle distractions of even noble causes that can become temptations if they're totalized. It's the only thing we think about all of the time. The third distraction is how our ego and sense of perfectionism can distract us from other people around us. And finally, he talks about how social media and marketing have stolen our attention. Then he offers us some ways to think about how we do that. He talks about, at the beginning, distraction in prayer. And I'll give you a few longer quotations from this letter because, as far as I can tell, it is not published anywhere, so you've heard it here first. Nicolas writes, "One does not need extraordinary insight or deep analysis to realize that what we call religious life has lost something of its impact in the church and outside of its walls. Of course, this is not universal. Some groups of religious have maintained and even increased their credibility by the authenticity of their life, of their service to the poor, or of the depth of their prayer. However, the questions persist. What is it that we've lost? Where have we gone wrong? Have we misunderstood our call for renewal? Are we aimless?" As an antidote to this, Father Nicolas points to spiritual masters that he went to revisit, like Ignatius of Loyola and Francis Xavier and Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. He goes to read these spiritual masters as models for how to refocus our attention and priorities in a world of distraction. The best part is it gives up the ghost on the idea that ours is the first period to ever deal with distraction. Distraction, he says, has been around for a very, very long time. He writes, "I kept asking myself, what is it that was so present in these spiritual masters that we seem to have lost? I think it is their total centering. They have been caught by the Spirit, the fire, the life, and the style of Christ, and they had stayed there, totally centered, probing its depths, rebuilding their whole lives around this new person, this new center." He notes that distraction in prayer, when he was a Jesuit novice, a baby Jesuit, if you will, that was nested in his larger, broader distraction in life. He writes, "This realization opened wide for me a door to awareness and to one of the most traditional Ignatian means of prayer, the examen prayer. I suspect you're familiar with it." He says, "I, like many of my friends in religious life, was not a bad man. We were decent folks, trying our best to do well what we were asked to do. From prayer to teaching, to playing soccer, to helping with the liturgies of Holy Week, we even sang well, but we were, as he says, distracted." First of all, he notes some of the easy distractions that people would have had. He said, "I would include here all the factors that belong to social, ethnic, or cultural groupings. It is, unfortunately, not difficult to find religious deeply involved in such groups." I don't think he was thinking about the Hibernian Order of the Celtic Cross when he was studying in Spain, or the Polish national ping pong team, or for me, maybe the German sauerkraut power-eating team. But I think there's a way that each of us can say, well, this is who I am, and therefore, this is my group. I'm not interested in others. His caution is that we can easily get pulled into groupings that have become our lives. A second temptation, he says, is an overweening emotional identification with groups that suffer. He writes, another of these easy temptations is emotional identification who suffer from some kind of complex. I find this one particularly challenging for me because as Jesuits and as people drawn to the gospel, we are called to walk with people who are excluded, those who suffer from historical injustices. And many of our institutions and much of the work you are doing is directly involved in that. And yet Nicolas seems to indicate that this too can be overwhelming if it absorbs every bit of our attention and emotional energy, or if we get into the savior complex mode. A number of years ago, as Tom mentioned, I was teaching at Cristo Rey up in Minneapolis, and I loved the work, and the kids gave me a lot of gray hair. I was only 33 at the time, but I got a full head of gray hair in my time there. I remember one time, one of my students, Pablo, he was swirling around in the back of the classroom, and I said, Pablo, get to work. He said, what am I supposed to do? Just get out a text, I don't care. So we opened up his biology textbook, and he says, hey, Mr. Simmons, how much do you weigh? I said, about 185. How tall are you? 5'11". You are slightly overweight. I said, maybe do some math instead. The goal of working with these kids was to love them and to care for them without getting pulled into the quagmire of issues that afflict them at home, very real issues, ones that I wanted to care about. But thankfully, I was able to get away every few weeks, well, actually probably twice a term, to get up to St. John's in Collegeville, where they had beautiful guest rooms for people to come and stay and just get a little silence and away time. And if you've ever been up there, it overlooks Lake Sagatagan, which is a beautiful, quiet lake. And all the rooms are facing the lake. And the guest rooms look sort of like an Apple store before it's gotten all the products in it. Clean, white lines. And I thought, this is exactly what my mind and my heart needs. Not to ignore the kids, but to become regrounded in God so that I can better serve them, I think. Father Nicolas also cautions against ideological thinking. It reminds me of Carl Jung, the psychologist, who says that people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. Nicolas writes, religious people who want to represent the gospel of Jesus Christ tend to be weak in the face of ideologies and ideological thinking. We have a hard time with the ambiguities and the gray areas of reality. Because we are trained for a total commitment, we easily project total truth onto any commitment we feel called to, and we become blind to the nuances, ambiguities, and even contradictions of a very simple worldview. This too, I think, is a very tricky, nuanced point. I think what he's saying is that we are called not to be dedicated just to the poor in general, but to particular people in times and places. So you who are in IVC, you do volunteer work in particular times and places, working with particular people. But the challenge I think he is pointing out is to approach them not with some savior mentality, but with the spirit of service and love, and listening to what are the desires and the needs that people bring forth. Many years ago, the Jesuits in Chicago, under the leadership of Father Brad Schaefer, who was headmaster here, I think, at one point, they went in and they had a big plan of what they were going to do in the Pilsen neighborhood. But before they did, they sent around a few younger Jesuits, including Jim Gartland and I think John Foley, to say, well, let's see what people actually need here before we presume to present something to them. So they went around and they said, actually, what we really need is a quality Catholic high school. And so they were able to adapt and not just say, this is what we will do for you, but to say, what is it that you need? How can we be of service? The third issue that Nicolas points out is the danger of perfectionism and a sort of a narcissistic distraction with, how am I doing? Am I looking good? How are things going? He says that not all distractions come from the outside. He notes, St. Paul, with the early Christians, reacted to very particular and visible excesses of some deeply committed groups, which he spoke of as Phariseeism. He goes on to say, modern psychology pays a lot of attention to the phenomenon of special concern for the self, for one's own image, for appearances, or the perceptions of a crowd. Some call it narcissism. It certainly fits the kind of distractions that we deal with as religious. We are distracted and distractible. We're distracted, paradoxically, by our drive for perfection. Here, those spiritual classics are a great help. These women and men followed Christ unconditionally in his kenosis, his pouring himself out, and were therefore undistracted by anything of the self that could get in the way. And so he cites in his letter Ignatius and Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, and he talks about how each of them in their own way used language of excess to express the totality of their concentration on God. For example, I even desire that I suffer the curse of being cut off from Christ. Or nada, nada, nada. Nothing, Lord, but you. The third way of humility that Ignatius talks about, where I totally submit myself to what God might desire. It's not hard to detect, he says, with more or less alarm, in my own self or in another individual. But this narcissism is harder to identify in the group or in the institution in which we work. The basic distraction is further complicated by smaller auxiliary distractions, such as competition or the compulsive need to be up to date in technology, to have electronic gadgets, to use new possibilities of communication, etc. The institutions can take the norm for measurable growth and progress and the guarantee of a future in a world of tough markets. Now, talking about institutions and everything might seem a little far afield, but in the United States, at least, the Society of Jesus is very heavily institutionally focused. It's 27 Jesuit universities, nearly 60 high schools, many parishes and retreat houses, and social ministries, some of which you are graduates of and deeply involved in. I'm not interested here today in solving all the institutional problems, except to point out that Nicolas, in another address to higher education leadership, said that there is a globalization of superficiality in our world, and it's the responsibility of those institutions that call themselves Jesuit, not to work for the greater glory of myself, but for the greater glory of God. And so I offer you a question for reflection. How can you, as people sharing in this mission of Jesuit education and Jesuit service, how can our institutions, schools and universities and parishes, how can they help our students cultivate a depth to their lives so that the service that we do is not ultimately about us, making us look good or making our CVs look good? To keep in mind that idea of self-kenosis, pouring out of ourselves without hope of reward or attention, I think that seems crucial. It's a question I offer you for thinking, and I'll list all these questions again at the end for table discussions. Nicolas also mentions that the ego is the number one distraction. He writes, "Our ego never rests and will always be drawn to attending to itself." We can safely say that the ego is the biggest source of distractions as we journey through life. I often find myself, when I'm giving spiritual direction people, inviting them to pay attention to their resentments, to where they can't seem to get out of a mental rut, because those resentments and those mental ruts will teach much about what it is that we value and where we feel our ego may be hurt or in overdrive. I think Nicolas knows something of this when he writes, "Experiencing contradictions or difficulties, at times even very serious ones, is part of living and communicating the gospel. The truly spiritual person lives through this experience with an enormous interior freedom that brings them into closer intimacy with God, with truth, and with the little ones who are the real experts in suffering. But those who are less spiritual suffer through difficulties and see them all as sort of an elaborate plot against themselves. They feel persecuted and naturally lose their inner peace and joy. Focusing on the misunderstood or wounded self ends up being a gigantic distraction in the spiritual life." When I was a Jesuit novice, there was a certain Jesuit who had control over us. It wasn't the provincials, so you don't have to go back Googling it. But I remember thinking that he seemed to just want to upset any and all of our desires. So we found out that, okay, I want to go to X, but he'll send you to Y. So you have to say, all right, well, maybe if I say I want to go to Y, he'll actually send me to X. But then he would say, now, do you really want to go to X, or do you just want to go to Y? Like, one step ahead of us. But But we'd always say that he's the sort of guy that if you ask for bread, he will give you a stone, and he always has a bag of scorpions at the ready on the side. And yet you realize that part of formation is being displaced from the center, that it's not always about you and what your desires are. Now, he might have had his own issues and hang-ups, but those were his. And so over time, a good spiritual question for myself was, in encountering people like that, is this ultimately about me, or is this something they're dealing with? And if it is about me, where am I called to grow? And if it's about them, can I just let it be about them and not lose too much sleep over this? So a good spiritual question when we find ourselves in difficult situations with difficult people. Is this, at the end of the day, about me, or is this something that they are struggling with? I think there's something about our resentments and pride that cuts us off from others and from reality itself. Nicholas writes, "Distraction also takes place when our human and spiritual horizons shrink. The most common way this happens, obviously, is when we fall in love with our own opinions, especially if we think that those opinions are intelligent. In fact, the best in town," these are his words. "We can be so distracted by our own opinions that, were we to enumerate them, we would never finish." Now, I think he's wrong in a lot of different ways, and I'm prepared to tell you at least 100 of where I think he's off. He says, when St. Ignatius offers the person finishing the spiritual exercises some rules to have the right feelings and attitudes about the church community, Ignatius is trying to help us to be free from the distractions of a narrow horizon. The words sound harsh and difficult to accept, he says, but what St. Ignatius wanted was freedom for us, openness to something greater than a few ideas, even if they happen to be from somewhere else. A question for reflection. When was the last time I changed my mind about something? What was it that allowed me to do it? And what was the fruit of changing my mind? I think this is important for our church as well, not just for our own spiritual lives. Nicholas writes, "The ego, distraction, is most powerful when a community or the spiritual relationship to the community fades away or disappears. We've made a commitment to find the will of God together as a body, as a community of faith, mission, and love. Here we find the true meaning of obedience, that often misunderstood vow of the religious." I think Nicholas, having traveled all over the world many times and living in Japan and Spain and elsewhere, he knows that living together as the body of Christ is not easy, especially if you're dealing with people who are bright and dedicated and critical thinkers. He continues that the bad news is that this is very difficult, particularly for the more visionary, the more intelligent, those more dedicated to one important cause or another. It's always much easier to go it alone on personal, emotional, or mental inspiration. But oddly enough, it's easier to appoint oneself a prophet than to discern with others and have to deal humbly with the weaknesses of our thinking or of our suggestions. You might have heard that word discernment in your larger discussions about where do I feel called to ministry? Where do I feel called to work? And part of that discernment is gathering data from others around us. In my own experience as an undergraduate, I did not want to join the Jesuits. I thought it's just what weird people did who have no other options. Maybe that is in fact the case, I don't know. But I remember a number of people saying to me, "Joe, have you ever thought about the Jesuits? Joe, I think you might make a good Jesuit." And it was terrifying. And I remember thinking like, not me, no thank you. But when you listen with ears open to receive information from others, to realize that our discernment about what we are called to do is nested in a much larger community, that I think gives us new insight into what discernment is. It's not just a one-on-one relationship with God. What's that? You want me to go into investment banking? Got it, okay. Tom mentioned that my doctoral dissertation talks about Virginia Woolf and Marilynne Robinson. Marilynne Robinson is a modern American public thinker who writes beautiful fiction. She wrote the book Gilead and Jack, Lila, and Home. Maybe you've read it, and if not, I highly recommend it. She writes very knowingly about the limits and the great capacities of people of faith, but especially institutions of faith. And she writes in an essay entitled Imagination and Community these wise words. Those of us who accept an historical tradition find ourselves feeling burdened by its errors and excesses, especially when we are pressed to make some account for them. But I would suggest that those who reject the old traditions on these grounds are refusing to accept the fact that the tragic mystery of human nature has by no means played itself out, and that wisdom, which is almost always another name for humility, lies in accepting one's own inevitable share in human fallibility. Wisdom, which is almost always another name for humility, lies in accepting one's own inevitable share in human fallibility. May we have the wisdom to accept our own limitations and recall that we are sinners who are yet called to live out our faith and to do so with other people who are likewise sinners and fallible and called to live out their faith. And we're called to model the mercy and patience with those of us in our lives, maybe who have fallen away from the faith, who don't find it to be important. Maybe a more succinct way of saying what Marilyn Robinson does in that essay comes from John the 23rd, who famously wrote, "See everything, overlook a lot, make a little progress. See everything, overlook a lot, make a little progress." I actually signed my emails with that to keep me from being petty, until I found it was too irritating, so I got rid of it. But I think if we can look at the entirety of our life, the work that we do, the people in our lives, inevitably there's going to be frustrations. There will be people who disappoint us, and we will disappoint other people. So we want to take in with a broad vision all of that, overlook a lot of the small issues, and try to make a little bit of spiritual progress in our lives. The fourth temptation that Nicolas identifies is distraction of the media and of market gadgets and the internet. Now, I know he might sound like an old man talking about you kids and your cornputers and your peapods and interwebs, but I think there is something very dangerous and real about the technology we face. I think he's right for the same reason that Matthew Crawford is right, and it's that our attention is what has been for sale. There's another book by Jaron Lanier who says 10 reasons to delete your social media accounts right now. He looks like the comic book guy from The Simpsons. And he was in the ground floor of the internet. And his point was not that it's useless, we have no use for it, but he's saying platforms that we use like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc., all of these are free to us to use, but somebody's paying for that. And what they're paying for it is whoever is paying to buy our attention. And his point is not that we are the consumers of the content, but we are the content that is being consumed. Our attention is what is for sale. And as soon as we realize that, and we realize how we get stuck into articles or things online and we get angry and we share them and we post them, that these strong emotions are being sold and utilized for something other than what we would desire, something other than what God might be desiring for us. This is what Adolfo Nicolas says. These distractions are the most common and the easiest to detect. They're right in front of us all, and few of us could claim total or partial immunity to them. Therefore, they're not the most dangerous. But I do think that these technologies distract us from that, such that all of our likes and preferences are spoon-fed to us, and we get isolated and just being fed on those things. Again, The Simpsons, which is one of my great philosophical books, there's an image of Homer going to hell. And hell for them is getting all the things that they like. And so the devil is sitting there force-feeding Homer donuts. He goes, "Oh, you like donuts, do you?" And Homer just keeps eating donuts and donuts until he, in fact, runs out of donuts in hell. And he said, "I'm not really sure. We've never had this happen before." But there's a way in which when we get glutted on the things that we love or the things that we think we love can actually make us sick. And I think that is the case with cell phones. I was on a retreat a few weeks ago dealing with it was a group of 80 women who were dealing with different issues. And one of the common threads of people of all ages, but even particularly some of the young mothers, one woman has 7 young children, and she says, "I just need to get away from them sometimes, and I go on my phone, and I don't like that." And I just think we would hope that kids' memories growing up would not be mom sitting on the bench in the playground staring at her phone. How is it that we can be responsible custodians and users of this technology, taking back a little bit of control of how it is used, but also how we use our attention in relation to that? Adolfo Nicolas says, maybe we continue to be distracted because we do not decide anymore. We have allowed the media to define a new orthodoxy or a new canon of truth that is not true anymore, but purposely constructed and uncritical public opinion. The way the new culture of information is developing confronts us with some basic choices. Do we want information or do we want understanding? Do we want speed or do we want depth? Centering in Christ or surfing the web? I know these are not exclusive choices, and none of us would dream of making them such, but they can become as real in our non-attentive life as any other distractions. So how are we to focus our lives a little bit more on God and avoid some of these distractions in our life? How can we go into our center a little bit more? I'll tell you a story. I was helping out at a retreat in Barrington at Bellarmine Retreat House. It was an 8-day silent retreat. I had a few directees, and one of them, I'll call him Father Mike, was beginning his 8-day retreat before he was about to take up a new position of administration at a major university. He wasn't sure what God wanted from him or for him on his retreat. And I suggested, well, why don't you pray with Jesus' ministry? I pointed him to Mark's gospel, which has rather short, nice stories of how Jesus is working, to see if any of those spoke to him. And he found himself praying with Mark chapter 3, which described the man with the withered hand. And that scripture goes, Jesus entered the synagogue. There was a man there who had a withered hand. The Pharisees watched him closely to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up here into our midst." Now, after the first day of reading with that, early in his retreat, he interpreted this passage as the leaders of the university calling him forward to overcome his fears of being an administrator and join them in the ranks up top. But then something interesting happened to him as he let the slow, silent workings of retreat work his way into his heart. In his downtime between prayer sessions, Father Mike was reading a novel that talked about childhood bullies taunting and physically assaulting one of the characters. And he slept on that book, and after a few days he recalled a suppressed memory of being bullied and assaulted when he was a child by his classmates. And then he went to one of his coaches and told him about it, but the coach did nothing to stop the students from bullying him. And in fact, the coach jumped in and taunted him as well. He described this memory recollection as being like a sliver wedged deep down into his skin, and only time and silence before God allowed it to work its way to the surface of his consciousness. What does this all have to do with our talk today? Well, the Greek for that line, into our midst, come up into our midst, is agaire eis to meson, which can also be translated, go into the middle of things, come into the center. It's as if the man with that withered hand in the temple was healed by Jesus in the synagogue by first going inwards, eis to meson, in order to identify and root out the memory that might needed healing in his life. For Father Mike, he realized that he needed time and sleep, maybe a little scripture, and time to pray, to discover where it was that Christ was already working to heal his memories. This takes time, it takes patience, and it begins with attention. Nicolas writes, "We tend to think that what does not fit in with my theories of life has no meaning, that if I cannot find the sense, then it must be nonsense. And we are quite intolerant with nonsense. Then we take the typical immature position of all or nothing, convincing ourselves that if I do not agree with someone, it must be meaningful, or must be meaningless. But St. Ignatius cut this tendency short with his rule to have the right sense with the church. He wasn't concerned with what made sense to him, but what would make the simplest people of his time, the simple faithful in the church. We tend to boast at times, I don't praise what I don't like. Ignatius tells us to praise everything that helps people in their devotion, in their prayer, their feeling close to God and to the community which is the church. So I ask you, what is it that you find nourishes your heart? What is it that nourishes your mind? And as you look around at other people in the church and you say, gosh, why do they do that? Or why do they pray that way? It's helpful to say, is this nourishing them in their relationship with God? Is it allowing them to grow more intentional in their love with God, helping them to come into their own midst? I'm sort of halfway between you guys, many of you who are young at heart, and those who are maybe very young who come and say, Father Joe, can you do adoration for us? Can you do the old Mass? And I'm just like, boy, I don't know what to make heads or tails of, because that's not my spirituality. Adoration, I didn't grow up going to adoration. But I think it's very interesting that young people seem drawn to this habit, this tradition of the church. And I'm not interested in so much the outward expression, but saying, is there something that they find that they're desiring that they're not getting in broader culture? And maybe it is a little bit of time in quiet, in silence, where their attention can be focused and directed and energized in a special way. What is that desire, and where is it not being nourished in our broader culture? Where in our own lives do we have quiet and space to be nourished by God, to go into our center, to find where it is we might not need healing, where it is we might have resentments or pride that needs to be brought before God? I mentioned during the homily that beautiful image that Ignatius had of being gently formed over time and being formed like a block of shapeless tree trunk. He writes, there are few people who realize what God would make of them if they abandon themselves entirely into his hands and let them be formed by his grace. A thick and shapeless tree trunk would never believe that it could become a statue, admired as a miracle of sculpture, and would never consent to submit itself to the chisel of the sculptor, who, as St. Augustine says, sees by his genius what the sculptor can make of it. Many people do not understand that they too could become saints if they would let themselves be formed by the grace of God. What does it take for us to recognize that call, that attraction from God, to be formed, to be shaped once again? I submit today that it begins with attention and paying attention to who or what might be directing our attention elsewhere. Think back of that idea from Matthew Crawford of the orienting reflex, where we are spontaneously drawn to new things, possible threats or opportunities for grace. It reminds me of the great English poet T.S. Eliot. You might have heard of him. His 4 quartets. He's actually from St. Louis, Missouri, but he sort of adopted this fake English accent. But he wrote some beautiful poetry. And some of his poetry, like in the 4 quartets, deals specifically with distraction and getting stuck either in the past or in some image of the future that keeps us distracted from our attention in the present. And he writes in one of those movements, Dries of Ages, men's curiosity searches past and present and will cling to that dimension. But to apprehend the point of intersection of timelessness with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death in love, ardor, selflessness, and self-surrender. For most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction fit, lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, or the winter lightning, or the waterfall, or the music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all. But you are the music while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood, is the incarnation. Friends, our faith is incarnational. We are spiritual beings who live in physical time and space. So I offer you now some questions to reflect on as yourself and maybe in your small groups, and then we will bring it back together. The questions that I've been laying out for you along the way. So maybe jot down a question or two that you want to sit with and talk about. If I am honest, are there ideas that have me rather than me having them? How is it that Jesuit institutions, our schools, our universities, our parishes, how can these institutions help students to cultivate a depth to their lives, to get through the globalization of superficiality? How can we help students cultivate depth in their lives? And maybe reflect, is there a person that you find difficult in your life that becomes too big of a distraction for your own spiritual life? Is it about them or is it about you? Another question. When was the last time I changed my mind about something? What is it that allowed me to do that? And what has the fruit been of changing my mind? And maybe, where do you feel God calling you to greater attention in your life, to a particular relationship, to a particular need for healing that you might have, a desire to go deeper into your core, into your center, to encounter Christ offering healing and love? Where do you feel drawn into your spiritual center? Take a moment of silence, and then you can share with others as much as you'd like or as little as you'd like, and then we'll bring a discussion back together in a few minutes. Okay?